My name is Mikael. I'm with a company called AP Technology, San Diego, California. We are a payment solution provider. We have been in the market for a long time, done everything from checks to now we do cloud. We do hosted and on-premise solutions for large banks and financial institutions. I have the honor of being the CTO, so I get to play with all the cool toys and learn about new technologies. I've been interested in blockchain and or Bitcoin now for 4 or 5 years or so. So not quite from the start, but pretty far back. I have mined my own Bitcoins at one point in the past and kind of have an appreciation for blockchain technology and some of the cool things that it may bring. So I'm going to give you an overview of how I see blockchain, talk about how it works, talk about different types of blockchains, talk about some of the strengths, some of the limitations that are associated with blockchain. I think we can all agree that there's been a lot of, I don't want to say hype, but definitely a lot of exposure of the blockchain concept. So I'm going to try and get a little more specific with some of the things. Specifically in terms of some practical use cases. And finally talk a little bit about how you might get started using blockchain and kind of getting into that world. So what we're not going to talk about is hardcore cryptography, which I am sure everybody is really sad about. So I might mention a couple of things such as hashes or fingerprints, but for the most part I'm going to try and abstract a little bit away from that layer of things. So as Travis says, please ask questions as we go along, and look forward to doing this. So before we get into that, I think this is a very kind of interesting cover story put out by The Economist, which labels blockchain as not a recent, like one of the most important recent innovations, but like actually as one of the most important innovations in the last 200 years, since the invention of joint stock companies and double entry bookkeeping. So it's some pretty heavy duty stuff that we're thinking about here. Looking at funding in that space, there is, in the last 2.5 years, invested 10 times as much as in the preceding 5 years into Bitcoin and blockchain companies. So it's also very interesting to look at what type of companies are working in this space. It's not just your kind of Silicon Valley fintech startups, but you're looking at banks, you're looking at financial institutions, you're looking at insurance companies, payment providers. Everybody is somehow invested in this in one way or another. Somebody did a kind of a unofficial study of kind of mentions of the word blockchain, and in the last 12 months, it has gone through the roof. So very interesting, it's very current, and it's trying to solve a very, very old problem, known as the double spend problem. So if I am purchasing something with cash, it's pretty straightforward. I will hand over some money to whoever I'm purchasing from. They take the money. There's only one copy of that $20 bill, unless I have a printing press, in which case we have other problems. And I can't very well just give that same $20 bill to somebody else, right? That's handed over, it's done. So when we're in the digital domain, it works a little bit differently. So let's say I have music or documents or PDF files that I'm transferring. I'm not actually transferring them. I'm giving a copy of them, retaining the original myself. So let's say I have the new album from country artist Rick Monroe, who will be on the panel tomorrow, by the way, if you're interested. I can give that to my friend, but at the same time, I could also give it to 3 other people or 10 other people, which is sometimes desirable, but not very desirable with things of value. You want to be able to control that. So the way we control that now is if I make a payment with a credit card or another instrument, we have a trusted intermediary. So this is a company or an organization that we trust with making sure I don't double spend the money I have. This can be banks, this can be big companies like Google, and others that control this situation. So people have been trying to figure out this problem for a while, like how do we take this intermediary out? There's issues associated with having a central authority controlling this. They are vulnerable to hacking, for instance. You have Target, Home Depot, even the NSA got hacked recently, which is a little bit scary. So it also adds friction to payments. So it takes longer time, costs more money. So trying to figure out a way to kind of solve this. So back in 2008, 2009, Bitcoin shows up. So famously invented by the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto, which is probably not any of these people here. The gentleman on the left is my favorite, Dorian. The guy in the middle, Dr. Craig Wright, claimed to be the inventor, and that was disproven rather publicly and embarrassingly for him, and he kind of disappeared again. So we're kind of left with, we don't really know who did this, but it's also not very important. What's interesting is the technology behind it. First published in a white paper, and then implemented as Bitcoin, and the first block mined in 2009. And ever since, it's been an unbroken chain of transactions and blocks added based on this technology, and it has not been broken yet. So it's got a pretty good established footprint now. There's some 5,000, 6,000 or so nodes running the Bitcoin network at the moment. And given that it's open source, it's relatively easy to make your own Bitcoin. Like you could download the source, change it, and launch whatever coin you felt like, sports coin or entertainment coin, whatever. So people have done this. And there are now some 800 or so different cryptocurrencies or similar based on the original blockchain on Bitcoin's source code. So these are all public blockchains, and you can buy currency in these blockchains if you should so want to. But most of them are either scams or experiments into trying different types of blockchain technologies that we'll get into a little bit more deep later on. So underlying all this is a fairly complex system that runs Bitcoin. And we're not going to go into the details of this. What is important is really to view this, I think, as a collection of technologies. And there's some interesting things here. The cool thing about Bitcoin is it didn't really invent much new. It was kind of like taking existing technologies and putting them together in a new way. So you have peer-to-peer replication, which is BitTorrent, if anybody's familiar with that, kind of the same file sharing mechanism. Digital signatures, hashes have been around for a long time. Something was added for proof of work, which I'll get back to in a minute, that kind of protects the integrity of the Bitcoin network. And there's stuff like incentivizing miners, so they keep these nodes running to ensure that the network is safe and not attacked. And there's other things as well, such as upgrades and so forth. So there's a whole bunch of technologies kind of packed into this Bitcoin thing. And then people started looking at, well, I don't necessarily know about Bitcoin itself, but these technologies are really interesting. You can do some cool stuff with this. So research started into this, and investment, and you kind of have blockchain sort of not forking off Bitcoin, but Bitcoin runs on blockchain, but blockchain is not Bitcoin. You'll probably hear those terms kind of intermingled, but blockchain is really a distributed ledger that has some of the features of Bitcoin, but not necessarily all the features. So we'll kind of depart from the Bitcoin portion of this and kind of look at just what is blockchain. So blockchain, when you boil it down, is a distributed data store. You have almost real-time distribution of that data among all the nodes in the network. Bitcoin was about 10 minutes or so per block added. Others can be faster or slower. It's based on strong crypto, which so far is unbroken, and until we see quantum computers everywhere, I think we're fine. The most probably famous feature of blockchains is that it's immutable, meaning you can't change data after the fact. So once you write data into this distributed database, it's there, and you can't go back and tamper with it. Now, in some cases of blockchain, that's actually not true. So we'll get to that in a little bit. But most public blockchains and Bitcoin function in that way. So certain people can write to the database, certain people can read to the from the database. How that's handled, again, depends on what type of blockchain that you have. And we'll get to that. So essentially, what you're looking at is a distributed ledger, and that's kind of where the whole thing starts. So all the participants in this ledger, if so authorized, they can add information into the blockchain. And this information can be a lot of different things. It doesn't have to be transactions. It doesn't have to be a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin. It can be all kinds of different data that you have an interest in storing this way. We'll get to that shortly. So to prevent people putting false information in there, there is something known as the consensus process. And what that is essentially that the participants of the network agree that data coming in is valid, and there is a burden to create blocks in the chain. This is what's known as proof of work in the Bitcoin world, and that's essentially solving a really hard mathematical problem. And by doing that, you create a cost to the blockchain. So if somebody was to try and redo the whole chain, then they would have to do all that work times all the blocks they're trying to change in a very short amount of time. So it makes it not feasible to try and attack the blockchain. It's technically possible. We'll talk about that a little bit, but very, very unlikely and not financially feasible. So the actual blocks that we're thinking about are not that complex. You can imagine a block of data, which can be transactions, it can be updates to the ledger, it can be hashes of data or actual data. So you might not store a full document in the blockchain, but you store a fingerprint of it, so you can later prove that that existed at that point in time. And something that's up and coming now is you can also store programs known as chain code in one iteration. So these payloads are put in blocks and they do what's called a hash. So there's a fingerprint of all that data, a unique fingerprint combined with some other points of data that then points to the previous block. And that's how it becomes a chain. So you always have a long row of unbroken blocks forming a chain. And that's how you know you have valid data.
So Michael, is there limitations on the payload and the size?
So good question, and a much debated question, I will say. In the Bitcoin world, there are very set limitations. Each block can be 1 megabyte, and that's causing a problem now because of the frequency of transactions. There's so many transactions that sometimes they don't fit in that 10-minute 1 megabyte block that's added every cycle. So Bitcoin world is trying to solve that now, and that's creating a whole bunch of problems. Other blockchains can set the rules as they like. So you can have more data in there, but quite often you'll probably include references to data and store the data somewhere else. Remember, everything you put in a blockchain is replicated to all the participants of that specific blockchain. So if you have it between multiple organizations, then they'll all have a full copy of this. So sometimes that's feasible, sometimes not. Yep. So this proof of work thing I mentioned before, like solving this really hard mathematical problem, is a bit of a problem because, I don't know if you've heard this, but Bitcoin network consumes a lot of power. Like we are talking, a while ago, one Bitcoin transaction consumed the equivalent of 1.6 US households energy usage in a day. So just from one transaction. Another study estimates that by 4 years from now, the Bitcoin network will use more power than the entire country of Denmark, which is quite a bit, or like a nuclear plant. So there's some scaling problems here for sure, and there's a lot of research into alternate ways of providing this proof. Yes?
Is it using the power because of all the miners and all the writing of these new blockchains and all that's how it's absorbing all that power?
Yeah, so in the case of Bitcoin, again, there's all these miners, and they're big factories, big operations that have specialized chips and specialized computers mining all this data, which again is kind of solving this mathematical problem that I started about, times thousands. So that consumes a lot of power. So another way to approach this is proof of stake, where you don't actually have to have all this mining power, but instead you kind of vote with the coins or the tokens you have on the blockchain. So you're guaranteeing the data is valid by looking at who controls how much of the blockchain, and they vouch for that data going in. That has another set of problems associated with it that we're not going to now, but it's one of the most promising ways to do it. This all goes for public blockchains, but there's different types of blockchains. So you can talk about a public blockchain, talk about hybrids, you can talk about fully private blockchains. And public blockchains is what most people hear about when they hear Bitcoins, cryptocurrencies. Those are all public. And there goes the thing.
You build a blockchain ship.
There you go, yeah. The power consumption went up. So for a public blockchain, everybody can read what's stored in the blockchain. And a common misconception is that all data in blockchain is secret or stored in a way you can't read it, which is not true. You can store plain information that you can read within blockchains, and people have done that. Anybody can submit a transaction into those blockchains and expect it to be included if it's a valid transaction that doesn't break any rules. Anybody can be part of the consensus process by running a node. You don't need to apply to join or do something else. You can just kind of start up and join into the network. And again, so this is secured by the kind of crypto economics and power cost that it would take to actually forge that blockchain. And somebody told me a number of how many $1 trillion it was, but it would be very expensive to do. It also makes it really hard to change anything after the fact. So the block size question that we just had it's been going on for a year now. The relatively simple problem, do we change the size of these blocks? It's still being debated and various solutions are discussed for a relatively small thing. But it also means that developers can't pull a fast one on you. They can't just change something in the code and then all the money goes to somebody else. So there is a kind of pro and con associated with that. So going away from public, you can imagine a consortium of organizations that work together to have a blockchain. So if you have a need for distributed data across different groups, this is a way to do it. And then you can do away with all the mining and all the other kind of hurdles put in to ensure people don't tamper with the blockchain. And there's other ways to secure that when you have a trusted network of nodes and not everybody can just join in. It can be a legal framework with contracts, and there's research into other ways of doing this. And then to the other extreme is a fully private blockchain. Imagine owned by one company. They can control everything. If you want to change the rules after the fact or the data after the fact, you probably can. But so again, this kind of takes away some of the inherent strength of blockchain technology. If you lose the unchangeable feature, then it's arguable that you are not doing much more than just distributing data, which could be accomplished in different ways. But there is a lot of investment and a lot of activity into this, so it'll be exciting to see how that kind of turns out. So yeah, so what I'm talking about a little bit is what we put on the blockchain, right? So in the case of Bitcoin, it's value. We have these tokens that are just them, like they're just it. It's just a Bitcoin on a blockchain. It doesn't represent anything external. It has value because people believe in it, but that's it. There's no attachment to anything external of that kind. And then you can have asset-backed tokens, which represents goods or money or gold. There's companies that work with this. So Ripple is an example. They issue tokens that you can assign to whatever you want and then transfer them over the network, and then they can be redeemed at the other end for whatever that value was. So it's essentially using it as a transaction mechanism for external goods that are not necessarily intrinsic to the blockchain. And then a really interesting aspect of blockchain is that it's very good for registering that something existed at a certain point in time. So you can store a fingerprint of, say, documents or a trade agreement or anything else, assets that you store, and then you can later go on and see, okay, these were the people that signed off on this. There's a digital signature that you can't change after the fact. So you have an immutable record of these things existed at that point in time. So and we'll get to that in a little bit, but obviously that becomes really important for some of the use cases. So I want to mention something briefly, not get into it because it gets pretty gnarly, but there's a concept called sidechains, which is essentially, and most often used with the Bitcoin network, but you have a public blockchain network most frequently, and you want to do something it can't do. It's too slow, for instance. Like you want to do 1,000 transactions a second, and you want to somehow record it on the Bitcoin network, but it's too slow to handle this, or you want to do some contracts or something else that you just can't do. There's a way to create a separate blockchain and link the two, and that's what's referred to as sidechains. So you may hear that, and you can move value across these chains as well. So you can have a private chain and you can link it to a public chain. So that exists. So something else that's very relevant and very frequently discussed are smart contracts, which you probably have heard of in some context. And boiling it down, what it is really is it's a replacement for a legal contract with computer code. So you can imagine a forward-thinking law office might hire programmers in the future to write specific contracts and code that then live and are enforced on the blockchain by the nodes in that network. So it can be as simple as an escrow or recurring payment, or it can be more complicated. We'll get to an example of that. And these programs, they can update balances, they can move funds, they can take external input. They might get stock prices from somewhere for a contract, move money if certain things happen at a certain point in time. So this is an area with lots of activity, and there's some really cool things happening there. You can have smart assets using what I talked about before. So imagine supply chains where you have a digital, instantly replicated record globally of not only goods, but associated documents, bills of lading, credit letters, what have you, but also what subcomponents went into this, track their history all the way back, shipping, all that stuff. So this is happening now already within luxury goods, diamonds, for instance. Everledger is a company doing this now, where they're attacking the insurance fraud industry, which is a multi-billion dollar issue that can be reduced by using smart assets. So while we're talking use cases, settlements clearing is probably one of the areas with the highest activity right now. A lot of companies kind of see some low-hanging fruit there in cost reduction for remittance. Santander famously estimate to reduce $20 billion by switching to technologies like this, reducing settlement time. Lots of companies are working on this. An interesting company on the payments side of that is R3, which is very well known to at least some of the panelists here. I think it's more than 42 banks. Is it 50 now, or what are we up to? And they basically came out last week, and this is how fast things go, with a proposal for a distributed blockchain ledger to handle transactions and payments in that way. And outside payments, just want to mention this very briefly. As just brought up, blockchain is being thrown at a ton of stuff. Right? Artist rights, they talked about. If you can digitally represent that, you could put that on blockchain. Land rights is interesting. Olympics in Rio saw a lot of people getting moved out from their land, and there's allegations that was just kind of changed in a register somewhere, and now they didn't own the land. By some surveys, a very high percentage of people who think they own land have a somewhat questionable title. And something like blockchain could have an immutable record. So you can absolutely prove that this is yours. Once it's in the chain, you can't fiddle with it behind the scenes. Identity management is super interesting, as identities become more of a commodity. Whenever you sign up for a service, you give away some of your privacy. You could have absolute proof of who you are on blockchain, so everybody could verify you, but you could also have it fragmented, so you decide how much of that data you actually give out. There's companies working on that. Internet of Things, I know IBM is doing some interesting things with, and that's often mentioned, comes with its own set of challenges too. So, as promised, it's now very easy to get started with blockchain. It used to be hard. You have to set up servers and download weird source code from places you don't want to go. But now you have blockchain as a service spearheaded by companies such as IBM. You can go online with a web browser. I did this actually using IBM's Bluemix. Create nodes, put some chain code or a smart contract on them, execute it, run it, and it took me 15 minutes. I don't know, and I think we might see that actually done later today. So it's very, very easy. So to answer your question from before, there are now front ends. So it used to be somewhat complicated to get data out of blockchains, but now companies like this, they make it very easy. You have an API, you can go and grab whatever you want, and you can create nodes and add tokens and all that stuff. So that's made very easy for you now. I want to mention a couple of quick things towards the end here. How many people have heard of Ethereum? So a couple. So Ethereum is one of the most interesting, I think, blockchain projects out there. Started by a fellow, Vitalik Buterin, college dropout, of course, from Toronto. Crowdsourced $17 to $19 million to kind of build this, and launched it. And it is specifically designed to run apps. So you can you can create your own cryptocurrency on Ethereum. You can have a registry. It makes it very, very easy to do practical things with blockchain. So they figured we need a investment vehicle for kind of projects. So something called the DAO was created, the DAO. Have anybody heard of this? So this is really interesting. So this is a little bit freaky out there, but it's essentially a company with no employees. There's no people. It's all governed by rules. So people buy into the DAO. So you buy tokens, and then you use those tokens to vote on what projects you want the company to do, and then funds are allocated to whoever proposes those projects. And as with everything crypto, there has to be a little bit of drama. So right after the DAO successfully raised, I might add, $162 million from a crowd sale, it was hacked, and somebody stole a third of it, essentially by figuring out that you could spam transactions. So kind of like withdrawing money from an ATM. If you do it really fast, it didn't update the balance. So he just took a whole bunch of money out. And the reason that's interesting is because something happened that has not happened before, and that is the developers behind the DAO and Ethereum decided, nah, you can't have all that money. We're going to rewrite history. So they released a new version of the software called a hard fork, essentially. If you update the software, it's a fork. If you have to run it, it's called a hard fork. And they basically undid the theft, which has not happened. There's been a ton of Bitcoin, scandals and thefts, but this is a first, and it kind of goes against the kind of cryptocurrency culture and created a big rift. So there's now two Ethereums. There's Ethereum Classic, which has the unchanged blockchain with theft in it, and there's the Ethereum, which has reversed that theft. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. It looks like Classic might die on the vine, but we'll see. And so lastly, I want to mention the Hyperledger project, which I think Nitin is going to talk about in a little bit. Super exciting project where you can go right now to hyperledger.org. You can download all the code you need to run a blockchain. And they're creating some really cool technologies to run more advanced apps on blockchains. And I think that was it.